Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I was just going to give a little bit of background as to how this talk came about and the benefits of serendipity. About a year ago, we weren't able to use the entrance hall for our sandwiches and the like, and we had to use the common room in this building. And while I was in that common room, I picked up a little printed flyer which talked about digital wildfires. And I thought, that would make a good talk. So that's how we got to tonight. So really, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Marina Jirotka and Helena Webb, who are going to tell us all about digital wildfires. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just so before I start, can I just get an idea of how many of you actually use social media? How many use have a social media account? How many of you have more than one? Okay, so you're quite active. Do you use it regularly? Is it Facebook? Does anybody here use Instagram? Okay, so it's Twitter? So it's not Facebook, Twitter. Anything unusual?
MySpace.
MySpace? Blast
ResearchGate.
from the past. ResearchGate.
Sort
Sort of.
Any of us who refuse to use
Yes, I was going to say, is there anyone who doesn't? Refuses? Absolutely refuses. Okay.
Absolutely refuse.
Okay, excellent. Okay, that's really interesting. So, I, as Brian said, I'm Professor Marina Jirotka, and I'm Professor of Human-Centered Computing here in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford. And this is Dr. Helena Webb, who works with me in the research group, which I'll give you a little bit of information about. I've been here for as long as I can remember, and everything that I do here is focused on putting the human people at the centre of computing rather than running away with kind of innovations and developments that then people have to catch up with. So the kinds of things that we do, and I have a research group here, which is the Human-Centered Computing Research Group, and we focus very much on interdisciplinary research. We have quite a few staff looking at different projects, postgraduate students, and what we try and do is combine computer science and social science approaches, because it has to be socio-technical if you're considering humans as well in the design of what you're doing. We do things like computational analysis with human-computer interaction. We go out a lot to study people in their natural environments. So we do fieldwork observations. Many of us are ethnographers. We come from social science backgrounds, from anthropology or social science, and we have the kinds of methods that you need to go out and understand what people are doing, how they interact in environments, how they collaborate, and then trying to develop systems to support that rather than undermine it. So that's kind of background to what we do. I think if anybody's got any questions, it's good to just sort of, if you stick your hand up, because I'm quite happy for it to be more interactive rather than me just talking through it. So what we try to do in our research is we try to detail the ways in which the technology impacts on people's communication, collaboration, knowledge, infrastructure, in scientific work, in domestic settings, in leisure settings, in public settings. There's almost anything, we go to a lot of different types of environments. But what we're really trying to do is look at the ways in which technologies can be much more responsive to societal acceptability and desirability. This has become a very big thing, much more recently than when I first started, for example. And we're trying to promote and improve design and the responsible development of technologies. Responsible innovation is something that has really grown in the last few years, and this is something that underpins all the work that we do. So we try to develop new approaches to things like requirements elicitation and analysis that incorporate this notion of responsible innovation. So how can we develop technologies that are for the social good, basically? And when we are aligned to the security centre here, the cyber security centre, but what our notion of security expands that a little bit to think about things like well-being, trust, very much about trust, transparency, privacy, acceptability, and that kind of thing. So, the idea of responsible innovation is that you're doing science and innovation with society and for society. So the whole idea is that you're actually expanding the amount of people who are involved in the ways in which you innovate. And this is across scientific disciplines. It's not just computer science. It started with things like with nanotechnology, actually, as we understood that the types of things that we're doing in science and innovation now are extremely powerful and have the ability to actually transform our world in quite powerful ways. We are now trying to think of how we can anticipate what some of the intended and unintended consequences of those things might be. And this has now moved into computer science, particularly through things like now with artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, quantum computing, the things that are on the horizon that are moving very fast now. So we try to, the idea is that it's no longer the province of any one computer scientist or policy maker. These people, we all need to come together to think about how this is going to impact on society and keep these innovations for the social good and try to anticipate what the unintended consequences might be. So we do quite a few, we have quite a few research projects going on at the moment, like responsible innovation in quantum computing. Quantum computing here in Oxford is quite a big thing. Networked quantum in IT. It seems to be the thing that the government particularly are investing in heavily for the UK. Social media as a resource as a response to crisis events. Looking at smart societies and smart platforms. Algorithmic-driven online platforms. Algorithms are a big thing at the moment, how they increase bias in society. We've been looking at a lot of that. Reconceptioning cybersecurity. So that's the sort of things that we're doing is very much trying to anticipate what some of the more unintended consequences might be and how do we mitigate for that. How can we start to anticipate, not predict, but anticipate what some of these things might be. But what I'm going to talk about in this particular talk is about a particular project that I've worked on with a group of collaborators, including Dr. Helena Webb, who's sat there. And the project that I'm talking about ran from 2014 to 2016. But it covers a problem that remains highly contemporary and in fact has increased and is much more serious now than ever. And this is the spread of harmful content on social media. And what I'll do is start by describing the background to the project. As we all know, social media platforms have become hugely popular in the past 10 or 15 years or so. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and so on, they allow users to post content such as personal updates, viewpoints, news items, and then share it instantly with other people. And just to give you a huge idea, sort of an idea of the huge popularity of social media, the most popular celebrity on Instagram at the moment, the singer Selena Gomez, she has over 144 million followers who look at her posts daily. The most used platform, for example, is Facebook. It estimates that it has 1.47 billion users who log into their accounts every day. And they have 2.23 billion users who log in at least once a week. So 5 new Facebook accounts are created every second. That's quite mind-boggling, really. And this massive use of social media then creates this state of hyperconnectivity in which posts can be seen, shared by multiple people in a very, very short space of time. And this brings many benefits. There's a huge amount of benefits in this, a lot of philanthropic work, sociality, building up solidarity in times of tension. If there are disasters, people can instantly start to donate money and get accidents and emergency to places that are really required of it. Like many things, everything's got a dual use. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problems around this also. So a report that was written by the World Economic Forum in 2013 described social media at that time as a global risk factor due to the possibility of digital wildfires. And these are, they identify digital wildfires as the rapid viral spread of information that is either intentionally or unintentionally misleading or provocative with serious consequences. So the way that Baroness Greenfield described it when I first heard this on Radio 4 in the morning, she said it's like standing up in a theatre and shouting fire and everybody runs. And whether that fire is real or not, it sort of instigates this kind of panic. Digital wildfires then involve the spread of content that is harmful in some way. A rumour, false information, malicious campaigns, hate speech, and so on. And one example that was given in that World Economic Forum report occurred during the Hurricane Sandy storm that hit New York in 2012. And this was one of the first ones that we were aware of. Yeah. So during that Hurricane Sandy storm, while a lot of people in the city were very worried about what was going on, one Twitter user who was known as Comfortably Smug, he posted a series of breaking news updates about damage and mayhem that was happening all around the city. And he posted that the stock exchange was underwater, that there was a total power outage across the city, and that all public transport would be halted in New York for a week. And these posts were sort of rapidly tweeted and even repeated then on CNN. But they were all false, and they were simply the inventions of the poster. And what it actually did was create a huge amount of tension and panic in a city that was already very upset about what was happening. It was a very difficult time for the city anyway. A further example then, another example of this type of thing are the multiple death and rape threats that were sent from 80 separate Twitter accounts to a feminist activist in 2013 after she was involved in a high-profile campaign about banknotes. So you can see that these kinds of digital wildfire scenarios emerge quite frequently on social media. And in recent years, we've got another one here, a photoshopped image of a Sikh man was spread a number of times in a malicious campaign that wrongfully connected him to terrorist attacks. His own selfie was actually altered to make him look like a terrorist. And that led to a huge amount of damage to his reputation, and it again heightened that sort of panicking kind of feeling at an already tense time. And finally, sports people seem to constantly get it. They suffer campaigns and abuse because they did help their teams win or because they didn't help their teams win. They are constantly getting all manner of abuse on social media. But finally, of course, concerns over fake news continue to grow in public discourse. This deliberate and or unintentional false information can spread really quickly. It affects people's behaviours and views, and we're becoming increasingly aware that social media affords this kind of content to become trending in users' feeds, and then it encourages more of the kind of deliberate promotion of a campaign that's misleading information, either for monetary or political gain, and it can also affect, as we know, the results of political elections. All sounds very good, doesn't it? These kinds of scenarios then, in which harmful content spreads rapidly, really has the capacity to undermine the well-being of individuals, of groups, of entire communities, and as we know, of entire countries. They can cause particular damage at moments of societal crisis or tension. They're particularly dangerous as content can spread so quickly that other agencies like the police or traditional news media, they can't mobilise in time to actually try and mitigate what's happening. So, digital wildfires, therefore, give us a real challenge. It's a challenge to the governance of social media. What can we do about this? Surely we ought to be able to do something. The World Economic Forum report says we have to have careful consideration of the ways in which the spread of harmful content on social media can be prevented or limited or managed. At the same time, it highlights the tensions between preventing harm and protecting freedom of speech. Now this is the big one, it's protecting freedom of speech. So if we look at here, the quote, establishing reasonable limits to legal freedoms of online speech is difficult because social media is a recent phenomenon and digital social norms are not yet well established. The question raises thorny issues of the extent to which it would be possible to impose limits on the ability to maintain online anonymity without seriously compromising the usefulness of the internet as a tool for whistleblowers and political dissidents in repressive regimes. So it's not as simple as just stopping people talking, because it's actually a really good tool for where there's repressive regimes and people are able to get things out into the world, really. So the report asks, the World Economic Forum report says, how can social media then be responsibly governed to prevent harm in a way that respects the freedom of speech? And that was the point at which our project started. So I led a project called the Digital Wildfire, Misinformation Flows, Propagation and Responsible Governance. And that ran from November 2014 and was funded by the Economic and Social Science Research Council. It was a collaboration between social scientists, computer scientists, and computer ethicists, and this was from the universities of Oxford, Cardiff and Warwick and De Montfort. And we drew on this concept of digital wildfire, and it's very captivating, it's conceptually very illuminating in many ways. We drew on that concept as a means really to try to investigate the harms that were caused by rapidly spreading social media content. And we also took up this challenge of trying to identify opportunities for responsible governance of social media. Our central question then was, does the risk of digital wildfire necessitate new forms of social media governance? And in order to try and address that, we did a series of kind of different research activities. We began by trying to scope the ethical and regulatory issues relating to digital wildfire scenarios. And as I'll describe in a moment, we identified 4 key mechanisms for governance. Each have their own strengths and limitations. So they are legal, social media platforms themselves, institutional and user self-governance. And I'll go into those in more detail. We also examined social media content in more detail, beginning with a qualitative interaction analysis of social media data, and that helped us then to conduct a quantitative analysis that examined user self-governance in action, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail as well. We ran a policy Delphi, which consists of a series of online questionnaires that get information and opinion from very professional, different types of professionals, like lawyers, computer scientists, academics, NGOs. We went to a whole range of different people to give us kinds of their views on different opportunities for the responsible governance of social media. And we also looked at, a very interesting part of this was looking at social media platforms in action. So people who are using these things, the police organisations, schools, anti-harassment groups and so on. So that was really very interesting. And then finally, we used all those findings to prepare educational materials and contribute to policy discussions, which I'll go into as well. So in the rest of the presentation, I just want to cover some of our main findings. I won't have time to go into great detail, so I'll invite you to ask questions at the end. The main findings I'm going to describe then relate to the scale and breadth of the problem, the complexities and the limitations of current governance, the potential value of counter-speech and user self-governance, and the value of education and engagement. So the first finding then relates to the scale and breadth of the problem of harmful content on social media. When we did our field work, we found that a wide range of agencies are having to deal with rapidly spreading harmful content of different kinds. Those various different agencies then need to deal with large volumes of potentially harmful content, of lots of different types of harmful content. For example, misleading information, hate speech, sexualized content, and this was especially in schools, inflammatory interactions on social media and online platforms. So we have a quote here the first quote is from a staff member at the Ministry of Justice, and they told us of the various community groups that deal with inflammatory or hateful posts targeting them. For example, Jews, Muslims, black people. There are concerns in those communities that those posts are actually going to spread tension, and they see a rise then in harassment. The second quote, we see a staff member at a large city council told us how the easy acceptance of tweets as truth enables rumours to spread. People seem to just accept it as truth. And this can spread false information about what's happening in an area. It causes unease, panic, and so on. The third quote we have is talking to schools. This was a big eye-opener for both of us. I mean, the whole group, we were just astonished by this. It helped us to realise the extent to which young people are emerging as a particularly vulnerable group on social media. It's easy for them to access various platforms and to post on them, but many of them don't have the maturity to understand the consequences of what they're actually posting and what they're sharing. The spread of sexualised content here is a particularly big issue. And the last quote is that the quote from a staff member at an organisation who's helping people to deal with hate crime, and that demonstrates the volume of social media content that they now have to deal with and the level of resources that they actually are needed, that they have to dedicate to it. So the second finding relates to the complexities and the limitations of current social media governance. We began the project with a scoping exercise to try to identify the main governance mechanisms that exist at the moment in relation to the regulation of digital wildfires, and we spent time looking at their application in practice. So one form is actually legal governance. So in the UK, there are a number of ways in which a social media post can be seen as a breach of criminal law, and prosecutions might occur. For instance, the case of the feminist campaigner that I referred to earlier, who was sent death and rape threats, actually led to prison sentences for a small number of the users who were involved in sending those messages. This week, we've had reports suggesting that those who posted images online of the Grenfell Tower effigy being burned on a bonfire, that they've actually now been arrested because they're making this public, the content that seems to incite hatred and public disorder. But really, compared to the huge number of social media posts that are made every day, the extent of the legal intervention is actually very small. A more common form of governance is that that's imposed by social media platforms themselves. Typically, setting up any kind of account requires the user to actually accept a series of terms and conditions. These set out, not that anybody ever reads them, but these set out what kinds of content are and are not appropriate, and they list the sanctions that might follow if users are actually in breach. And this might be the removal of a post or the suspension of an account. Now, many platforms have automated systems that can actually block the posting of offensive images, as we know, and sometimes of offensive language. But in most cases, they rely on other users identifying harmful content and actually reporting it, and then typically not doing much about it for a long time. Then there are two other forms of governance that we can add to this list. Increasingly now in our workplaces, we're finding that institutions themselves are imposing policies on appropriate use of social media. So if you're posting from the University of Oxford and the Department of Computer Science, there are things that you can and can't tweet about. And in several cases, these institutional forms might lead to users being sanctioned for their posts. And then finally we get to the opportunities we actually have for user self-governance through people monitoring their own and others' social media behaviours. So those are the four four current governance mechanisms that we identified through the project. During the project, when we spoke to different agencies, they frequently told us of their frustrations over the limitations of the first two forms of governance that I talked about, legal governance and governance practices used by social media companies. So if we look at quote 1, for example, our respondents told us of varied responses among the police when a potential crime on social media is reported. Sometimes the police are helpful, but at others they just don't appear to take social media seriously, implying that the content can actually just be ignored rather than considered harmful. But increasingly we found that they are inundated with this stuff. They can't actually manage the amount of cases that are being reported to them. They don't know what to do with it. Sometimes they actually know very little about how social media platforms really work. For many people who work in organisations that try to help people affected by social media content, the current UK law is very unclear. Some posts can be acted on, for example, those that make specific threats of violence, but the thresholds of evidence that try to pursue prosecutions can be very high, and it's actually quite unclear which posts can be illegal or not, as that quote suggests. If you look at the second quote, other respondents then tell us that social media platforms are actually quite unwilling to engage with the police and other agencies to try to deal with harmful content. And that appears to differ over time and according to which platform you're looking at, which social media platform. But some people that we've spoken to are quite cynical about the extent to which platforms really want to try and deal with this. They don't want to be, quote, the arbiters of truth. Our respondents themselves also frequently show an awareness that the platforms themselves are mostly based in the US, and they tend to follow a model that prioritises freedom of speech. And so they are reluctant to remove any content that is harmful, but not necessarily illegal. It's important then for their own brand image to allow freedom of expression. You often hear them invoke this, that they value freedom of speech over and above everything else. And definitely these platforms have come from the US themselves. So, in the time following our project work, the situation with regard to social media platforms has changed slightly. We increasingly hear of initiatives being run by platforms to address that spread of harmful content on their sites. For example, Facebook now posts advice about spotting fake news. And as you pointed out earlier on, they've also got Nick Clegg now, who's going to help them through this minefield. And Twitter has announced plans to involve the user community in creating policies to limit harmful content. What's been argued more recently is that the controversy that surrounded the high-profile Cambridge Analytica debacle and the reports of systematic fake news factories, for example, has created this unique situation where the platforms now are under much more pressure than ever in order to improve their public image. And it might be that because of that, they'll voluntarily make their governance practices more stringent to try to boost their image, to create that trust again with people where that trust has been lost. However, what's going to happen there remains to be seen. And certainly when we try to put together the current landscape and the views of our project participants, we see that there are practical limitations to the current governance of social media. There are a large number of cases that are not dealt with, meaning that people, individuals and groups continue to suffer, they suffer harm, and that organisations who are set up to help them are limited actually in what they can do. We also observe that the legal, social media and institutional governance mechanisms tend to act on individuals rather than on the large number of users that are associated with digital wildfires. And they're also, of course, retrospective. They're dealing with posts or users after that post has been spread and the harm or damage has been caused. But we do find that fourth form of governance, user self-governance, has some capacity to be prospective and to limit the spread of content in real time. And this is the topic of our third key finding. User self-governance then relates to the ways in which individuals can monitor their own behaviour on social media and the behaviour of others. It relates to things like the use of privacy settings and reporting inappropriate content to platforms or even to the police. It refers to the ways in which users can issue challenges to fight back against content that they might see as unverified or inflammatory. And many of our study respondents were enthusiastic about the capacity for user self-governance, as many of those quotes show. I think it's because literally it's the only thing that they can do is how to monitor yourself. So in our examination of social media content, we actually focused, so we looked in detail at some of these things as well, and we focused on the ways in which users post and respond to apparently hateful posts that are made on Twitter. So we collected posts from various sources, and including what we call sentinel sites, such as yes, you're racist, yes, you're sexist, and yes, you're homophobic. These are particular sites where they identify posts that are treated by other people as racist, sexist, homophobic, and we also collected the posts that were marked as responses to those original tweets. And this sort of enabled us to get a conversation. It's really important not just to look at a single tweet or to look at a single word, but actually how that conversation developed through a Twitter thread. Well, that's what they call the conversation, a Twitter thread. And sometimes this involved the original poster, who may or may not defend their original post. Other posters may join in to agree or disagree, or to present evidence against it, or to support the claims, and so on. And we found a number of features that were associated with these cyber hate posts. So, for example, there's definitely the use of inflammatory vocabulary, as you can see in that first example. The use of neutral descriptors but have some kind of negative content. Can't stand women. It appeals to what everyone knows, or apparent opinion is presented as facts. We all know this particular thing. Use of extreme or absolute terms when presenting a personal opinion. Girls shouldn't ever rap, so on. And the frequent use of I'm not sexist, racist, homophobic, but, and then something follows that is hugely racist, homophobic or sexist. And we became interested in the possibility that disagreements posted by users to a hateful post could actually be forming the action of counter-speech. For example, challenges to the validity of claims made in a post or the credibility of the poster actually serve to push back against and counter that hateful content. So they might not have an influence on the original poster, but it can be seen by other people who might then reflect on their own views. And we wanted to assess how that might work, how the impact of counter-speech on conversation threads, and therefore how that might actually push it back. So we used our qualitative analysis as the basis for a much larger quantitative analysis work. And we were really interested then in this possibility of counter-speech occurring. That's the ways in which users might join the conversation to treat a previous post as inappropriate or try to kind of refute it in some way. So we used a coding frame to actually identify these posts, and then looked at the interaction features that were actually occurring in them. So our qualitative analysis, our qualitative analysis helped us to actually identify the interactional features of Twitter conversation and the characteristic of posts and their responses. And this helped us to explore the possibility of disagreeing as counter-speech, and also to prepare for the quantitative computational analysis that we did later. So we collated a large data set of Twitter threads, each starting with a post that was either sexist, racist or homophobic. We prepared a coding scheme. We ran 2 panel annotation tasks in which human coders labelled each tweet as hate speech, or agreement with hate speech, or disagreement with hate speech, and so on. We used the human coders to do that. We used the results of the qualitative analysis to produce text pattern matching rules, and those rules were then applied to the development of a counter-speech classifier, which was used to actually identify counter-speech occurring within a thread. The classifier was then applied to all the annotated threads to determine the performance of the classifier at identifying counter-speech in threads. And we then finally conducted modelling work to examine the trajectory of hate speech in Twitter threads. We used thread length as the dependent variable, using it as a proxy for trajectory, and tested it with a variety of independent variables. We built up regression models to test the hypothesis that thread length will be associated with the presence of particular types of counter-speech and various actor composition. Our key finding then was that thread length is related to disagreement. Disagreement as a measure on its own increases thread length. So a few users interacting and disagreeing extends the threads as people enter into discussions with each other. But as the number of different contributors to a thread expressing disagreement rises, the length of the thread goes down. So it actually seems that multiple voices of disagreement serve to quell the thread length. And this occurs through all kinds of hate speech spread in our analysis: sexist, homophobic, and racist. So we suggested that disagreement can actually function as a form of counter-speech, successfully shutting down hateful conversations on Twitter. So a question then comes about as to whether this form of user self-governance can actually be promoted in other mechanisms or through other mechanisms, like the provision of esteem ratings by social media platforms for people who fight back and against some kind of cyber hate.
Just a quick question. A lot of social media platforms tend to emphasise the more responses to something. The more responses to something, the more comments, the better something is. So might it not be the case that if multiple voices of disagreement quell a thread length, that will make it less popular overall in the social media platform? So it's kind of a little bit problematic.
Well, what we're trying to do is quell the spread of hate speech.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Okay, so then that would be a good thing.
That would be a good thing. That's what we're trying to say.
Cool.
I mean, we're looking at how can you stop the spread of hate speech like sexist, homophobic, and some. This speech is pretty radical, awful stuff. We're not talking about just like, oh, I don't like chips or Nick Clegg or something. I mean, this is really, really nasty stuff. So we found through all of this analysis that the more people who actually came in to disagree with this, and certainly offering evidence where this was not correct, that would serve to kind of shut it down.
But did it actually stop the person who posted the original tweet just starting another similar tweet? I mean, they've got those views, they're just going to carry on. Those tweets are permanently out there. Whether people object or agree with them makes no difference. They're all out there for everybody to see, and that person will just carry on.
Yeah,
How are you going to stop them? If you can't actually identify the person and name and shame them, which you can't, how are you going to stop them?
So, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, so we didn't, it would have been very interesting actually, in the work we didn't look to see if those posts kind of like reappeared somewhere later, and I think that would be a very interesting thing to do later on. And it's very kind of difficult to trace these kind of things, and I think for this I always say that what we've shown here is that we don't necessarily know if people ever change their minds because of the argumentation that occurred, but we know that they shut up, and maybe that's kind of a good thing in itself, because at least it's stopping the instance of the hate speech spreading in that particular space. But what consequences it then has, does it, because it's so easy for people to set up a new account on social media, even
with a different handle. Yeah, you wouldn't even know if it was the same person.
So it would be very interesting, I agree, to do that kind of like longitudinal work to see actually if we can trace kind of known users and see if they do reappear later on. But it's kind of like perhaps one mechanism that can exist amongst a whole range of other things as well, and at least it has a benefit of that it works in real time as well, because with everything else, if you see a hateful post and then you have to report it, and then you can wait a long time before Twitter or Facebook or wherever will take it down. At least with this one, if you're kind of doing something that stops the hate speech, it's in real time, so it has that kind of benefit to it.
A key element here seems to be anonymity. What are your guys' thoughts and positions on the anonymity that we offer internet users at the moment, because there are technological solutions that can stop people being at least anonymous. So what are your thoughts on removing the anonymity?
Well, I think we would agree that that's what should be done, but the social media platform providers are a different story.
Yes.
So,
I mean, I heard your point earlier about social political dissidence. That's an incredibly
important part,
area
yeah.
to deal with.
I mean, there are obviously contexts in which anonymity is very important. There are ways around that, I would imagine, but then you'd have to know the context and the country and the context in which you're working, or where your platform is working. It would be reassuring to know that they're trying to deal with these types of things, but we're not even sure that that's happening at the moment.
Well, the platforms themselves,
Mm.
I think commercial pressure will build up where they will have to, simply because they want to stay in business, and there are other elements of their business that just will work better. They're targeted advertising and things like that. If it can't be manipulated, it's more valuable to them. So I think commercial pressure may well build up anyway.
Yeah.
We need to decide that we didn't touch that earlier on.
I think that's something that I referred to earlier, that we've certainly found that after Cambridge Analytica, things are slightly different now.
But I'm thinking from a more subtle viewpoint as well. They manipulate the things that you view so that you get the advertising that they choose. Well, if people start to really become aware that that's what they're doing, then they'll generally have to get their advert out together and be unbiased across the board in terms of allowing access to people's comment.
Can't but hope. So the last finding that we had was the value of education and engagement. And when we asked our respondents what they felt were appropriate ways forward for the responsible governance of social media, they often said that this idea of communities working together and the value of fostering responsibility on social media was important, and to do that through education. So for some organisations, that involved bringing social media platforms and the police into the discussion to try to find alternative solutions, as you see in number 1. But it was actually very difficult for us to interact with the social media platforms, and I'll talk a bit more about that when I get to the government at the end. But initially, when we were starting this project, they were very reluctant to engage with us, and I think, as you know from Facebook, it's still quite difficult to get social media platforms to come and account for themselves. The schools often told us that it was really important to work closely with community support officers to help them to try to tell children the seriousness of what they're actually doing when they are sexting, for example, without involving the children themselves in legal cases. I mean, we found that really extraordinary and quite difficult to deal with. So education then was actually valued because it could teach different kinds of users about the nature of these sorts of communications.
One thing about this is in the UK anyway, the system's so stretched that there's so limited resources that teachers are barely, coping teaching, let alone on top of that. And also, how would you expect teachers to be equipped to teach the children all these things? Because this is all new to all of us. It's come up since the last 10, 15 years. Teachers sometimes might not even be on social media. So how you, as a society, as communities, how can they address it without resources, without knowledge, without links to universities, to other,
It's absolutely true that they're overstretched, but we did find some schools that were doing amazing things, and what they did was actually harness the children, and because the children know how these things work, and so they would get like digital champions in the schools. So perhaps some of the older children, they would have certain kinds of classes where they would start to show the dangers. But the champions, the digital champions, the children themselves, would then be responsible for telling the other children the dangers of what was going on. These schools would also actually not allow, they had a firewall around the school, so there was nothing, there was no tweeting or anything going on within the school, which, you know, the minute they're out of school, they're doing it anyway. But the idea that they could harness the children's technical ability, which they didn't have, the teachers didn't have, so that they did it again as a community group. They had teachers, police would come in to talk about the dangers of this, the digital, the champions, the younger digital children champions themselves would be part of this. And together they came up with a policy in these schools of how to do that, and those policies have then spread to other schools as much as they can. But I mean, you're right, there's no digital literacy going on in schools at all at the moment. So then, because of the importance that was placed on education and engagement that we found from our respondents, we focused on this really in some of our outputs, and in particular we focused on young people. We hadn't realised really how vulnerable they were. Cyberbullying, texting, all the different kinds of behaviour between young people and teenagers. So what we did was we worked with and we've done this quite successfully with other projects, we worked with an animation company to produce a video animation, and this was quite successful. We called it Taking Care of Your Digital Self, and I'll play it to you in a bit. And this encourages young people aged 9 to 14 to think about what's happening when they post something on social media. And we did this in collaboration with these schools, with these digital champions. The strap line, actually, not only the taking care of your digital self, but the strap line of what goes online stays online, came from that school. And that kind of thing goes into your head, what goes online stays online. And they started to appreciate that whatever they put online will be there forever. So they started to think through some of those issues. We also ran youth panel competitions where they could send us different work of their views on social media. So things like art, poems, interactions that they were having. They were incredibly creative, and some of it was really moving. And if you want to have a look at it, it's on the Digital Wildfire website. And then they came to a big showcase that we had, and some of them got prizes. And it was really very, very moving to see what their experiences were. I just want to play you that Digital Wildfire animation that we put out, because this all went on to the internet safety website.
Good weekend! Bet you can't wait to tell your friends, and maybe post those pictures on a social network where everyone can see them. But, every time you post something on social media, a picture, a comment, a video, you're building your digital self. Every post leaves a digital footprint, and together, those footprints make up your digital self. It's a permanent record of everything you post. It can't be erased. When you share something, the information is sent to the social network and stored on its server. After that, people who see it can share it, save it, post it, or send it anywhere they like. You can't stop them. So even if you decide to delete your original post, it will leave a footprint wherever it is shared, saved, posted, or sent. It will always be a part of your digital self. That doesn't matter much when it's just a holiday snap or a chat with your friends. But do you feel the same way about everything you might post? What about a message sent in anger after an argument? Or a comment that's insensitive or offensive? An embarrassing photo that you thought would be kept private? Or that reveals private details about yourself or your home? It might feel right at the time, but what about years, or even just minutes later? How would you feel if those things existed online forever, for friends, family, future employers, and even complete strangers to find? What goes online stays online, and that's why it's important to ask yourself, Before every post, what does my digital self say about me? Online and offline, you are part of a community. And if you need more advice on how to safely use the internet, there are people you can turn to. But to take full advantage of the wonderful world of social media, first you've got to take care of your digital self.
Okay. So all that kind of stuff led to a request for us to go and give evidence to the House of Lords Select Committee on Communications for their inquiry into children and the internet. And from that, they actually appointed me a specialist advisor to the rest of their inquiry. That Select Committee produced a report called Growing Up with the Internet, which I would invite you to have a look at if you're interested, which makes recommendations on how internet policy should really involve the participation of multiple stakeholders for the promotion of digital literacy for children, and various other recommendations as well. That report was then debated in the House of Lords, and the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport responded to the committee's report and announced the launch of the government's Green Paper for an Internet Safety Strategy. Now, Baroness Beban-Kidron, who is on that House of Lords Select Committee, and she promotes children's right to be forgotten, in the sense that what you do as you grow up should not be on the internet forever. We all made mistakes as we grew up. It's appalling that it will be there for everyone to see, nailed down for eternity. So she campaigns for the right to be forgotten in a thing called Five Rights, and she is now tirelessly working to promote something called Age-Appropriate Design Code that all companies should attend to when they're developing technologies that could be used by children. So finally, I'd like to just end on some kind of methodological and ethical issues that we dealt with that gave us quite a few headaches on this project, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on. Methodologically speaking, we ran into quite a few difficulties dealing with social media content. The large-scale analysis doesn't always map comfortably onto these social media posts. For instance, many of the counter-speech posts that we observed in our data sets could have been expressed or were expressed via sarcasm and ironic agreement to imply disagreement. So this was something that human analysts can identify very well and with relative ease, but it's a lot harder for computational techniques to do. And then in our qualitative analysis, we routinely faced questions over whether we should try to gain consent from individual Twitter users to publish their posts. This is something we have to do as researchers anyway. You have to get users' consent before you interview them, before you use their data. Were we supposed to do the same with Twitter? Twitter is an open platform, and according to its own terms and conditions, you can expect your posts to be seen all around the world. But does that justify us then examining users' tweets and reproducing them in academic papers or here without their knowledge or their consent? It would be very unlikely that a post a user made that they would imagine that it would be ending up in an academic journal. It's unlikely also that their posts of cyber hate, that they would agree for them to be published. And then, of course, what are we doing if we are then enhancing and promoting hate speech in this particular, we're identifying who said it, where it was. It's very easily found. If you just Google it, you can find out who said it. So we had a lot of problems. But then, of course, you can't fake your data. You can't and you can't do it by proxy either for some publications. You have to have the real data. So we got into a bit of a dilemma there. It was a nice ethical dilemma that we didn't resolve. Anyway, so that's a brief run through the project. Since the end of Digital Wildfire, we've tried to work on more of these issues, and in particular now we're focusing on algorithms, on the algorithms that drive social media, and other platforms, other online platforms, and how particularly they're creating bias and systematically disadvantaging certain populations in the demographic and the population demographic. So we'd be very happy to take some questions from you now, if you haven't all got Turkey to press.
One of the concerns I have is that I'm sure the security services are quite capable of monitoring everything that's going on. They've done very well with monitoring terrorist traffic. This is a form of terrorism. It's terrorism against our children. And yet, no one at government level seems to be using the resources we have to eliminate the damage. My question is, wouldn't GCHQ be much better employed instead of getting rid of a few terrorists, getting rid of a much more serious problem, which is the health of our children?
I couldn't possibly comment on that. It is true that, so Baroness Bevan Kidron is a huge voice in this space, and it has taken a long time for people to recognise what is happening to children. You know, we regulated the BBC, for example, as the 9 o'clock watershed. We regulated the content mostly with tried to that children were exposed to. Now they can just see anything anytime.
But people have known about this for years. We've known about cyberbullying. We've known about kids getting bullied, wanting to kill themselves, and nothing is done. And nothing can be done. What you come up with are very small things, but it's not going to stop unless you can take down. Why do the gurus in Silicon Valley, people like Zuckerberg, why are they forbidding their children to use these social media platforms? Now that says something. They're allowing everybody else's kids to use them except their own.
I need to come back at you on that. There are commercial products which can be bought and you can apply them yourself that will filter a lot of this content. So there's a lot of IT companies have set up to actually produce products which are very successful and have been in existence for some years. I think what may be missing is that the government doesn't promote these things. I personally know a number of products that are incredibly successful if you can apply them for your children.
I was just going to say, as a follow-up, the three main areas that we seem to be working on are counter-terrorism, serious crime, and human trafficking, including sex crime. So this is something they are actually working on. But that thin line between, I know, cyberbullying would probably come under that because that's not completely illegal. But if you're trafficking a young person from abroad into Britain and you're using a computer to do that, that would come under that. So you do get into the very lines between what is free speech, what do people actually consent to. And I think the ethical thing that you brought up to about consent, that reminds me of, I think we saw it online, of course, about rewriting the terms of service so that children can actually understand what they're actually consenting to. And when they saw, for example, the terms of service of Instagram and what they were actually consenting to, who owned their data, where it was going, how advertisers could use it, how third parties could access it, a lot of kids were like, that I didn't realise, you know, education, as you said, is a really large burden. But I mean, it's hard enough for us to understand the digital consent.
Yeah.
And the terms of service, to my mind, kind of make that really difficult.
They are obfuscated.
Yeah, and again, there was, you know, the art project where a guy read out the entire terms of service of Facebook or Twitter, and it took like a voice actor 8 hours of continuous reading to read it out. To be like, you know, that's ridiculous. Who's going to read that, let alone understand it? So I think there is a lot of issues in terms of, you know, people understanding consent about data, where it goes, why it's, you know, it's out there forever or not.
I was just thinking if it's possible to have ethical committee or ethical panel on the social media providers doctors, psychologists, and actually they will drive as a legal thing what will happen next, whether those companies can go that way. But then, as you you're coming to this, when it's privatised, it's driven by profits rather than driven by ethics and serving society, which is what it's professed to do. Then those two contract each other.
They don't have to, they do. Yeah, and of course it's taken them so long to claim any responsibility. Yes. They originally just said, we're just providing a platform, what goes on with it is not for us to have any responsibility.
At the moment, who has got the authority to regulate what is happening, as in to put the social media and platforms actually in line? Because right now I'm not seeing anything that is done or in place to actually, we have got regulations in multiple areas, and this is, I don't see any evidence of governments actually having any expertise, let alone, future-proofing what's going to happen.
It's actually very difficult because it's a global thing, and many of these are also US companies. So it's actually quite hard. We talked about just trying to identify, according to UK law, what tweets, for example, were breaking or in breach of the law. And that's not clear. Some of them are, if it's violent content or if it's, aggressive. But that's not clear. And so what jurisdiction we have over on how we might try to mitigate that. And on top of that, these companies now are so wealthy that, is it Google or Apple? I can't remember which one now, has just reached $1 trillion.
They're political powers in their own right, almost.
They are powerful superpowers, really, in their own right.
Could I pick up on the international element? Your counter-speech analysis techniques, how well can they be applied into other cultures and other natural languages? Were you able to put some thought into that?
We didn't have time within the scope of the project, but certainly interaction analysis, which is one of the things that Helena is an expert in, this happens in different languages, so this can be done in different languages. Japanese, so there's no reason I can't.
And then there's the cultural differences, of course, that need...
Cultural differences as well, and how you recognise, that's one of the problems with computational analysis and having any kind of machine learning or natural language. How you recognise irony, it's very hard to do that, especially if you're not looking at the thread.
Yes, but that is the beauty of counter-speech, using the natural ability of the human being to protect himself.
Yeah.
Did you find many threads where there may have been an apology by the original poster due to subsequent posts?
One.
Just one.
There was one very, very nice discussion where the original poster came out. So actually, I think you're right.
Okay. I'm thinking about whether they were just stupid or against trolls who do this for a laugh or whatever.
Not really. We spent quite a few depressing months looking at Katie Hopkins' tweets because we reasoned at the time that she was public and therefore we didn't have to get consent. But then we realised we'd have to get consent for the other people on the thread.
She's a very interesting one actually because she'll post something that's sort of very, very provocative and then lots and lots of people reply and she never comes back. She sort of never re-enters the frame, as it were. So she is that kind of, I'm aware that there's a recording going on, but she's a kind of like classic troll in that she's posting something to get a response and then she just kind of like likes the picture every time and leaves other people to have
no responsibility
about themselves.
Exactly.
There's no responsibility and she'll just say something that's outrageous but always just slightly within the law because she has been reported to the police a number of times but never quite been prosecuted for it. But she can say something very contentious but then just leave it and not pick it up and not be answerable to what she said. And I think that's kind of alongside the anonymity that's one of the things that makes, because obviously hate speech exists offline as well. One of the kind of the key things about it when it exists online too is that people are anonymous, so they kind of feel emboldened to say something stronger than they would do face to face. But then also, because they're behind the screen, they don't have the immediate kind of censure of being held to account by the person replying to them, and that also helps people to kind of say something that they wouldn't necessarily say in a face-to-face situation. And I think those two are reasons why you see things being posted on social media that people wouldn't say, they wouldn't phrase in those terms in daily life, and then they get picked up and they get posted and get lots of attention.
I was just wondering about the counter speech. If you can actually change the use case, let's say in an oppressive society where they actually use that method to close down any arguments that they disagree with, like, I don't know, workers' rights or civil rights, let's take China for example, then they could use that technique to actually close down any conversations that they don't want to hear or be seen.
I think they've got other techniques to shut these things down, depending on the oppressiveness of the regime. They don't have the freedom of speech anyway, so they want to cut it down.
It's a good point though, because in a sense you could turn the good fire that you're creating around and attack what is perfectly reasonable and not fake news with fake responses.
But you can always try that experiment and see what happens. There's always a dual use to everything, isn't there? Whatever we do, there is a dual use to it. There's the other side. Yes, I suppose you're right.
Yeah, I was encouraged by what you were saying about the benefits of education. I remember reading a comment, I think, from Dean Moore's theory about the danger of people being inclined to believe anything, the printed word, because it's big and black and backed by authority. But is there a danger with the shut-down approach, the government's approach, of actually making the problem, the wildfire problem, worse? Because it seems to me that the tinder that thrives on is the distrust of official media, the feeling that it's controlled, that we're told what we wanted, what people want us to believe. That distrust is going to be exacerbated if control is seen to be exercised in other areas. Which you can't criticise the government, somebody might hear you, is the extreme form. But I can see this make, this is what scares me, it could make the distrust worse, and that is that serious downward that happens for all of us.
There are people that are doing research on the provenance of data now to try to in real time, be able to, or just after, be able to assess the provenance of the data to tell people that it's valid or not, which would be good. I'm not sure how they're doing it, it's quite a novel thing. But there are companies now that are playing that they can do this and see if it actually works. But that would be one solution to that. When we use user-generated content, it's this amazing thing that we were all going to be able to have our say and this can't happen.
I'd like to push back in a couple of areas. I think you concluded, without much evidence, that these sites should not allow anonymity. Or did I hear that?
No, I said I said I would.
Right, apart from the fact that that would be extremely unlikely, because the American First Amendment guarantees anonymity of free speech. And Voltaire himself, who was the founder of free speech in many minds, had a pseudonym, Voltaire. And the second thing is, shouldn't we really look at this area as an area of assumption of risk? So if people are stupid enough to go on these websites, aren't they opening themselves to being offended? And shouldn't we just have warnings on the first pages and then let them get on with it after that?
Okay, so I mean, partly children, I would worry about children in that sense. So we're not
I'll accept the children exception.
And then we also want to think about the amount of digital maturity that people have. So they often don't understand where these things are going in terms and conditions again, what's happening to their data, where it's being used. I mean, even, you know, people I know who seem to be sensible people, sensible adults, will still put pictures of their children in the bath on Facebook, you know, and this will go all over the place. But they don't think through what might actually happen. I don't think they're stupid. They're just, it's a completely different space in which they're working or operating in. That's where the education comes in. So when you start to think about, or make them aware of that, what might happen to that data, where it might go, and they might start to modify their own behaviour. So it's that user self-governance.
Or user self-control.
Yeah.
But sometimes the harm's caused, the people the harm's being caused to, they haven't done anything on the platforms themselves. So, you know, when I was talking to some of the anti-harassment groups, they were talking about cases of Muslim men who had their photographs taken and were rumours being spread about them calling them paedophiles. And they weren't logging onto the platforms themselves, and they weren't paedophiles. Someone had just randomly taken their photo and named them, and, you know, said where they worked and spread that in their local community. And they hadn't done anything themselves. It was other people who were doing it and having campaigns against them, and actually Twitter refusing to take the content down as well. So this is the kind of situation, because I see the point that you're making about kind of not kind of like wrapping people in cotton wool and so on. But some of the situations that people are in, their own actions couldn't necessarily have prevented that from happening, because all kind of they are victims of the things that have been happening. And in any case, you said that there's an assumption of risk, and you need to be open to be offended, and that's true to a certain extent. But we don't say that about life. You know, we don't say that offline. We say, oh, well, whatever, open to be offended. So, you know, we don't necessarily want to do that about everything on social media as well. Because I mean, some of the things, you know, it's not just people kind of like battling back and forth about Brexit and calling each other a few names. Some of the stuff that goes on is really extreme, and it's very, very harsh, and it affects people's lives in very deep ways. And things aren't necessarily being done about it. It kind of falls between the cracks of responsibilities. The police don't know how to deal with it or can't deal with it. Social media platforms don't want to. And you have organisations, you know, like these anti-harassment groups that people turn to, and they can't do anything either. All they can say is, well, you know, don't go on the platform. Or we'll try to call the police, but they can't help, and we'll try to contact the social media platform, they won't take you down. There's nothing we can do. So people are losing trust in all these institutions. They go to the police, they can't help them. They go to these different organisations, and they can't help either. So it creates a very deep problem, I think.
I'm going to sound like an old codger, which I suppose is what I am. But
just be proud.
No, what I'm going to say is, historically, you had idiots scrawling something on a wall, and it you know, was seen by the local community. The problem, in a sense, with the likes of social media and the like, is the fact that it's seen globally, and therefore it's out there very quickly. Do you think that we're trying almost to solve what I call a management problem with technical solutions, in the fact that we seem to have lost respect for other people? And if you engendered more respect between everybody, you'd sort of quell some of the problems we see. I don't know how you do that.
The current president of the United States would be a start.
Well, exactly.
Well, yes.